Welcome to Raw Online. Today class is about the cervical sympathetic chain. The learning objective is describe and demonstrate the extent, formation, relation, branches of the cervical sympathetic chain. Sympathetic chain, there are two sympathetic chain, the right and the left, and each sympathetic trunk is paravertebral in position. What is the extent of this sympathetic chain? They extend from the base of the skull to the first coccygeal vertebra. And where does they terminate? The two trunk, look at this two trunk. These two trunk fuse and form an unpaired ganglion impair in front of the coccyx. See, you can see the ganglion impair, yes. So, we have the two sympathetic gangliated trunk. So, how many sympathetic ganglion are present? In the cervical region, if you take, there are 3 ganglion. Whereas in the thoracic region, we have 11 or 12 ganglion. And in the lumbar region, there are 4 ganglion. And in the sacral region, we have 4 to 5 ganglion. And the ganglion impair is always a single and which is present anterior to the coccyx. Now we are going to see only the cervical part of the sympathetic chain. What is the location of the cervical part of the sympathetic chain? Which lies, this is the cervical part of the sympathetic chain, which lies behind the carotid sheath and in front of the longus colli and the longus capitis muscle. Initially, the number of sympathetic ganglion corresponds to the number of spinal nerves, but later they fuse. So, the upper 4 cervical ganglion, they fuse to form the superior cervical ganglion, and the 5th and the 6th cervical ganglion, they fuse to form the middle cervical ganglion, and the 7th and 8th cervical ganglion, they unite to form the inferior cervical ganglion. So, the cervical part of the sympathetic chain consists of superior cervical ganglion, middle cervical ganglion, and the inferior cervical ganglion. You can look at this picture. This is the superior cervical ganglion, which is formed by the fusion of upper 4 cervical ganglia, and this is the middle. So, this is the middle cervical ganglia, which is formed by the fusion of the 5th and the 6th cervical ganglia, whereas the inferior cervical ganglia is formed by the fusion of the or by the joining of the C7 and C8. So, these are the 3 cervical ganglion: superior cervical ganglion, middle cervical ganglion, and the inferior cervical ganglion. What is this stellate ganglion? The inferior cervical ganglion and the first thoracic ganglia fuse to form a stellate ganglia, which is otherwise known as cervicothoracic ganglia. Now, we will see the cervical part of the sympathetic trunk. The cervical part of the trunk does not receive the preganglionic fibers through the white rami communicants from the cervical segment of the spinal cord. This point is very important. So, the cervical part of the trunk does not receive the preganglionic fibers through the white rami communicants from the cervical segment of the spinal cord, but they give the postganglionic gray communicants to all the 8 cervical nerves. So, where does this receives the preganglionic fibers? All the preganglionic fibers for the cervical trunk are derived from the lateral horn. That is the lateral horn cells of T1 and T5 segments of the spinal cord. This point is very important. All the preganglionic fibers, see, this is the preganglionic fibers, preganglionic sympathetic fibers for the cervical trunk is derived from the lateral horn cells of T1 to T5 segments of the spinal cord, and they ascend through the trunk before and then they rely on the cervical ganglion.